that large-scale investments, if not carefully planned and executed, can create large-scale problems with longer-term consequences. With the several announced large-scale projects, one of the foreseeable impacts will be on the housing needs for the poorest, lowest-paid workers, the unemployed, and pensioners. What provisions are being made for them? This, Mr. Speaker, is of immediate concern to the opposition, as the country is currently experiencing a deficit of affordable housing or shelter for our working poor, the unemployed, and pensioners. Merely announcing these mega projects, Mr. Speaker, is enough to increase the price of housing and housing real estate, as speculation in the marketplace is likely to result. Mr. Speaker, the NHT is a very important part of my portfolio assignment, and considering the challenges foreseen at the lower end of the housing sector by the impact of these mega projects in the context of the unmet need for affordable housing solutions, the role for the NHT must be examined. It is agreed, Mr. Speaker, that the role mandated for the NHT in the housing sector as a contributory scheme, assuring of benefits to its contributors, remain sacrosanct. However, Mr. Speaker, it is equally true that successive administrations have justified their action in utilizing substantial sums of money for other than providing housing solutions to contributors, and in the process, deviating from the original intent of the statute. These have had to be accounted for by amendments to the parent statute. Perhaps more justifiable, Mr. Speaker, are the significant social support given to initiatives such as inner-city housing renewal programs, benefiting non-contributors for whom a justifiable case has been made for the use of NHT's funds to, among other things, stabilize the housing market at that end of the spectrum. For these and other good reasons, Mr. Speaker, the opposition welcomes the review of the NHT undertaken by the then chairman of the Housing Trust and our new Minister of Finance and Planning. The review process, Mr. Speaker, has been rigorous and its findings and recommendations far-reaching. The opposition is of the view that this important document should be treated with the respect it deserves, and hence the opposition is calling for a debate on the review document in this honourable House. Such a debate will be both timely and necessary, considering the far-reaching recommendations, and will serve to inform the Jamaican people on a matter of fundamental importance, Mr. Speaker. So, Mr. Speaker, we look forward to having such a debate. In conclusion, Mr. Speaker, I end where I started, by reminding you, the members of this honourable House, and the wider public, that planning, especially spatial or physical planning, will determine the standard of development and the realization of sustained economic growth, leading to a better quality of life for the Jamaican people and a sustained environment for growth. I warn, though, that the various sectoral plans hatched in the different ministries, departments, and agencies, unless coordinated and integrated into a national framework, will not be able to realize the growth and development that has eluded the people of Jamaica over these last 40 years. Mr. Speaker, I have shown here today, through the example of the UDC, that our current framework for planning is fragmented and in need of urgent repairs. The opposition is calling on the government to not just contract foreign consultants to produce a national spatial plan, but to put in place a local mechanism designed to ensure that an appropriate consultative process takes place and a national spatial plan emerges that will form the basis of a new national planning framework with strategic policy choices that can guide planning at the national, regional, and local levels. These plans, Mr. Speaker, must be evaluated, monitored, and enforced in accordance with the strategic land use choices made only after appropriate stakeholder consultations. Mr. Speaker, we expect that in the process, we will rationalize the institutional framework and the conflicting pieces of legislation to create an improved system for speedy approval of applications for building permit. This will unleash more development and more jobs in the construction industry. The adoption by the government of the Logistical Master Plan and industry analysis will go some way in alleviating the immediate challenge of a broken planning system. But, Mr. Speaker, the devil is always in the details, not just in the planning, but also in the implementation. Here, Mr. Speaker, the opposition supports the choice of the Special Economic Zone Authority as the implementation body and calls for the requisite resources to enable timely implementation. Mr. Speaker, we have learned the lesson that not all mega investments bring with it the desired outcomes of good-paying jobs and sustained economic growth. Those outcomes must be properly planned for, including the appropriate negotiations with private capital and the necessary land use controls put in place as a condition of these investments. Additionally, Mr. Speaker, government must ensure that the supportive infrastructure is in place to meet the needs of the developments and to mitigate environmental impacts. This is why, Mr. Speaker, the next PNP government will deliver a plan to integrate land use and the transport sector in order to ensure a focus on transport logistics and the build-out of supportive infrastructure for the logistics hub in both urban centres and in rural areas. Mr. Speaker, only then will we see and enjoy the growth and development that have eluded the Jamaican people over these 40 years. Mr. Speaker, the government's failure to respond in a timely manner to the urgent issues highlighted will be the clearest signal of its failure to plan and its plan to fail the Jamaican people. Let us not repeat the grave mistakes of the past. Let us plan wisely. Let us implement smartly. Let us include the people at every level, and let us finally give every Jamaican a chance at a better life. May God bless Jamaica, land.
House Leader.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. And I think there were a number of items that were raised by the member that were very, very well thought out and things that we can take on board. No question. Good speech. Now, Mr. Speaker, the next member to present to Parliament is the member from Southeast St. Andrew, and he is the opposition spokesman on science and technology. I invite you to invite that member to make his presentation.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Mr. Robinson.
Thank you, members. I wish to begin my presentation by giving thanks to my constituents who continue to repose confidence in me and have returned me here for my second term in Parliament. I want to acknowledge the councillors, Kari Douglas, Andrew Swaby, the members of the constituency executive team, Sonia Forbes, Ivy Hill, and all the other members of the executive who are here, and my constituents. I want to thank my family for their continued support and the guidance that they have given me to perform my responsibilities. The political family led by the opposition leader has entrusted me with the responsibility of the science and technology portfolio, and I thank him and I thank my colleague parliamentarians for their support and encouragement. And finally, to our Lord and Savior, who gives me the strength and courage to take on the challenges of today and tomorrow. Mr. Speaker, I intend to structure my presentation today within the framework of the ICT roadmap, which was developed in 2012. The ICT roadmap was an action-oriented portfolio of initiatives formulated over three distinct time horizons: 5 years, 3 years, and an 18-month time frame. And there were 4 main components of that: national strategy, policy, and legislation, which looks at strengthening the ICT governance and administrative framework through the development and promulgation of key pieces of legislation, supporting policy guidelines and regulatory reform. And I'm going to start there. And I'll start by providing a critical analysis of the Data Protection Bill, which is currently before a joint select committee of both houses of this Parliament. Before going into the specific concerns, I want to make a point on the principle of consultation. I have no doubt, Mr. Speaker, that we will have a stronger, better data protection bill which serves the interest of the country because it was subject to a joint select committee of Parliament. There have been almost 30 contributions and presentations by stakeholders, individuals, and groups. And I just want to urge us as colleagues that we must always trust the wisdom of the people when we are developing policy and legislation. On the Data Protection Bill, the Data Protection Bill 2017 is a landmark piece of legislation with far-reaching implications for every facet of our society. Indeed, this bill is of such profound significance, not just for industry and commerce, but more generally for the economy. It is also vital for individuals to an extent that it borders on being constitutional. The fundamental questions regarding the ownership of data, particularly personal data, go to the heart of this bill. This is the crux of the measures enshrined in the bill, because depending on how the question is answered, we could go in one direction or another. Another extremely pertinent consideration, particularly in the context of globalization, is international cooperation. The health, in fact, the very survival of our economy will be dependent on our ability to continue to do business with our international partners. This shines the spotlight on our foreign policy. In the international arena, the plain reality is that there's an inequality of bargaining power. So despite our sovereignty, there are instances in which more powerful players on the world stage play the tune to which we would be well advised to learn the dance steps. Almost 5 years ago, we had FACTA, and our financial sector simply would not have survived if it had tried to resist the edict from the US in this regard. In this instance, so to speak, the edict is in respect of data protection, and it is coming from the European Union. Mr. Speaker, on Friday of this week, May 25, 2018, Regulation 2016-679, the General Data Protection Regulation, better known as the GDPR, will come into force for all EU member states. The significance of this for countries like us that are not member states of the EU, i.e. third countries, is that we will only be able to continue to have personal data of EU residents transferred to us on the basis of an adequacy decision from the European Commission. To get that adequacy decision, we will have to demonstrate that we offer a level of protection of personal data equivalent to that which is provided by the GDPR. In essence, then, we have to comply with the GDPR just like we had to comply with FACTA. Technically, Mr. Speaker, we could say no. The EU cannot force us to follow the GDPR any more than the US could technically have forced us to implement FACTA. But ask yourself, what kind of business in today's world does not necessarily entail the exchange of some amount of personal data? And can we really afford not to do business with the European Union? While we support this bill, I must say our support cannot and will never be of blind and uninformed support. To do that would be a dishonor to the oath that we have all taken as members of Parliament. The bill as presented has some gaping holes, Mr. Speaker, and I will briefly use my time not just to highlight them, but to make recommendations which I believe can strengthen the Act. The first area that I want to look at is the wide-ranging powers of the Office of the Information Commissioner. The Office of the Information Commissioner is created at Section 4 of the bill, and the applicable functions are clearly set out in the said section. These functions fall under two broad headings, general and specific. And an example of a specific function is that the Commissioner can encourage members of trade organizations, for example, lawyers, doctors, to publish voluntary codes of practice. An example of a general function is that the Commissioner has a duty to promote the observance of the Act by all those whose activities are affected by the Act. These are just two examples of the far-reaching responsibilities that the Commissioner has. We on this side of the House take the view that with such great responsibility and with the potential to impact on the lives of every Jamaican, the provisions as they exist in Section 4, subsection 4 of the bill cannot stand. Subsection 4.4, which is equivalent to the wording of Section 5 of the Contractor General Act, and Section 94.6 of the Constitution, which deals with the Office of the DPP, provides in effect that the Information Commissioner is not answerable to any other institution or person within the Jamaican state. And we believe that provision is a dangerous one which must be amended. How do we propose to achieve the balance between independence and accountability? One option, which is the traditional one, is to impose a mandatory duty on the Information Commissioner to file annual reports to Parliament, as is now required by the Public Defender, the Contractor General, and other commissions of Parliament. Of course, while the Information Commissioner is not a commission of Parliament, the office is a body corporate, a term defined under the Interpretation Act. This would not preclude the imposition of such a duty on the Information Commissioner. This, we believe, would be a step in the right direction because the submission, and we say a step in the right direction, because the submission of an annual report is only part of a mechanism that should be put in place. Accordingly, and having special regard to the fact that the right to privacy is engaged by the Information Commissioner's role, we are of the view that the bill should also create a permanent Information Committee of Parliament, which should be conferred with the power to require appearances by the Information Commissioner where or if there's an issue that arises associated with the functions of the Information Commissioner that raises a matter of general public importance. The decision of the committee to summon the Information Commissioner can only be exercised by this Permanent Information Committee of Parliament after it has given the Information Commissioner an opportunity to respond in writing to the concerns raised. We believe this will balance the issue of the powers of the Information Commissioner with an appropriate level of accountability and transparency. The second area, Mr. Speaker, of concern with the Data Protection Bill is that it forces media personnel to reveal the sources of their data. Freedom of expression, Mr. Speaker, is a fundamental right guaranteed by our Constitution. Of particular concern is a provision in the bill that could force media personnel to reveal sources of the data. And I just want to read the clause because I don't think many of us would be conscious of this clause. The clause is Section 6, subsection 2C2, which gives the data subject, which is the person who the subject of the data, a right to have communicated to him or her any information available to the data controller as to the source of the individual's personal data. So let me just break it down in practical language. So if I am, for example, the source of a story, I'm the data subject, I have the right to ask the data controller, in this case it would be the journalist, to reveal to me the source of their information or that story on me. Now, what that does is it, in effect, would break the principles of privacy and confidentiality. And we already have defamation laws which provide protection for those persons who may be injured by a publication. Further, publication of journalistic material, Clause 37 and Clause 2.1, which are expressly exempt from a number of the provisions. However, this too is subject to a determination by the Information Commissioner. In effect, then, the ability of journalists to protect their sources and, by extension, the integrity and the vitality of the media are placed by this bill squarely in the hands of the Information Commissioner. And we believe that is untenable, dangerous, and something that should be changed. Mr. Speaker, two other recommendations. We believe that this bill should be subjected to a 3-year full parliamentary review, resulting simply because, Mr. Speaker, the nature and the fast-pacing change in technological developments mean that what would necessarily exist today is not going to be relevant. And I give an example. This bill is actually predicated on a combination of the UK and an EU bill, which right now is actually not being used anymore in those jurisdictions. And in fact, they have both moved to different versions of data protection. And we are actually casting our bill based on one which is outdated. So we believe it's important, it exists with the Cybercrimes Act, that we build in this the 3-year review. The final area I want to talk about, Mr. Speaker, is the issue of the time frame for the implementation of this bill. Frankly, Mr. Speaker, an across the board 12-month transitional period fails to take account of the nuances of this bill. This bill affects from large corporates like our big banks to literally somebody who's a cook shop operator, or an NGO like a football club, a citizens association, who has to keep records of their membership, name, address, etc. They all become data controllers. So this is a bill which has implications for a wide cross-section of businesses, individuals, groupings within our society. We believe that the 12-month period is aggressive and will have, and many of the small and medium-sized enterprises, many of our NGOs are going to have a great difficulty in complying with the requirements of this bill. It may be easier for the large corporates who could assign someone from a department or even outsource it to a third party. But for small businesses, they won't be able to do so. So we are recommending, Mr. Speaker, a 24-month period for the implementation of the Data Protection Act. I now want to move to the second area of the ICT roadmap, which is ICT infrastructure. And here, Mr. Speaker, much of the work that currently is being done in this area represents a continuation of policies and programs started by the previous administration, the community access points, connecting our hospitals, or libraries, or police stations with high-speed internet access, the tablets in school project. A number of these initiatives were started by the previous administration. And there are some new ones that have also been done. We believe while it is important to increase access to infrastructure, it is even more important to ensure that there's a process of public education to ensure the proper use of the technology. So for example, I know the government is moving to put Wi-Fi on JUTC buses, and I believe that's a good thing, and we have no issue with that. But what you want to do is ensure that the kids don't just spend all the time on social media, WhatsApping and texting each other, and not using it in a productive way. Similarly, the Wi-Fi in public places, another good thing, which none of us could argue against. But it is important, while making these investments in the infrastructure, that we educate our youngsters so they can actually use the technology in a productive and positive way. In this regard, Mr. Speaker, we are recommending the launch of what we term a digital literacy program, and I will define what I mean by that. Digital technologies nowadays are key drivers of innovation, growth, and job creation in the global economy. Digital literacy has therefore become a prerequisite for creativity, innovation, and entrepreneurship. And without it, citizens can neither participate fully in society nor acquire the skills and knowledge necessary to live in the 21st century. Although, and this is the man who said the articulate minority is agreeing. Although basic literacy rates in Latin America and the Caribbean are higher than the global average, the gap in digital literacy and skills is a significant barrier to digital inclusion. Digital literacy, therefore, has to become a national imperative if Jamaica and Caribbean societies are to keep pace with global trends and remain competitive in the rapidly evolving digital economy. Digital literacy is the knowledge, skills, and attitude of individuals to appropriately use digital tools and facilities to identify, access, manage, integrate, evaluate, analyze, and synthesize digital resources, construct new knowledge, create expressions, communicate with others in the context of specific life situations in order to enable constructive action and to reflect upon this process. Mr. Speaker, there are some specific initiatives that we are recommending. One, that digital literacy be incorporated into mainstream primary and secondary education curriculum. I know CXC is looking at some of this, but we believe from the primary level, where many of our youngsters are exposed to the technology, that this be started at this level. Secondly, that through the community access points, as we continue to build them out, that an element of the handover of these community access points is that the members go through, of the community and the leadership go through exposure to the digital literacy so they understand how to use the technology in the most productive way. Using the GIS as an example, importantly, encouraging the private sector to come on board by providing private sector companies with tax credits to undertake broad-based digital literacy programs, and expanding the mandate of the USF beyond just infrastructure to ensuring that there's a digital literacy framework, to ensure that the investments, the large investments, and the sums we are investing in infrastructure, that we get a return on those investments. Mr. Speaker, I now move to the third area, which is ICT-enabled public sector modernization. And what do we mean by that? It's solidifying the capacity of public institutions and providing the governance framework to deliver efficient and effective public goods and services through the establishment of a more effective government ICT infrastructure and establishing the institutional capability to architect the overarching technology vision and provide leadership in the development and implementation of the government's ICT strategy and programs. Mr. Speaker, in 2015, our administration broke new ground by establishing the office and the post of the Chief Information Officer of the Government of Jamaica. Sadly, Mr. Speaker, since the new administration came in 2016, there has been instability in the office of the Chief Information Officer. The Chief Information Officer at one time resigned, went back to Canada. He was taken back on a part-time basis. Right now, Mr. Speaker, the Chief Information Officer is operating on a part-time basis. Louis Shalal. And we have no issue with the individual. He's a very competent individual. But right now, he, on average, my understanding is he spends a week per month here in Jamaica. The reality, Mr. Speaker, is that the work that is needed, and I just want to explain what the role of the CIO was envisioned as. Right, government operates in a very siloed fashion. All our ministries, agencies, and departments run their own ICT shops. There is very little or no communication across them. The office of the CIO was to provide the synergies, implement new standards, and try to ensure that government could work efficiently. And as we know, ICT is the backbone of delivering public services. In the current scenario, Mr. Speaker, where the CIO is operating on a part-time basis, it's not possible for that office to function effectively, and the gains that have been made in the public sector modernization are going to be lost. I'm urging the government to pay attention to this area and to bring stability to the CIO's office by ensuring that we can put someone in there on a full-time basis. Mr. Speaker, on the fourth area of sector capacity building or innovation enablement. And really this is the area where appropriate mechanisms to stimulate new business opportunities are implemented, and there's innovation and entrepreneurship in the local ICT sector. Mr. Speaker, this is the area that this administration has performed the poorest in and has actually reversed many of the gains that started in the area of entrepreneurship. In August 2017, last year, the government closed down the operations of Startup Jamaica. Startup Jamaica was set up as an incubator for tech entrepreneurs who had ideas, who didn't have a home, who needed a place to go into, to test their ideas, to work with persons who could share those ideas, and to put them in a position where they could move from the ideation stage to the stage of building businesses. For a number of reasons which I can only characterize as just plain mismanagement, the government has actually closed down the operations of Startup Jamaica. It was a startup. Huh? You didn't know it closed down? Since August 2017. Mismanagement since you took over, right? Mr. Speaker, Startup Jamaica had challenges, and I won't pretend it didn't, because it was a startup. But the government had enough of an opportunity. If they wanted to rejig it, if they wanted to restructure it, they could. But to simply close it down and provide no opportunities for our young entrepreneurs, I believe is a slap in the face to those who want an opportunity to move their ideas to businesses. Mr. Speaker, I want to shift a little bit. I know it's not you, but what is even worse is not him. But it's not him. It's not him. It's not him. It's not him. But I would say even more so, Mr. Speaker, there was a program called the Youth initiated with the World Bank, which again managed so badly it had to be shifted from MSET, I know the minister is in here, sent to the OPM. The monies have been reallocated and are now being used in the whole program. This, really? And so you don't give people the opportunity in the ICT sector. Mr. Speaker, again, this is a sad day that the government has actually not seen it fit to continue the work that we started in giving our young entrepreneurs the opportunity. Mr. Speaker, of the budget, the overall program, it was a $20 million program, which dealt with a number of areas. It dealt with Startup Jamaica, it dealt with animation, it dealt with providing training, exposing persons to venture capital, and all of these types of things. Again, Mr. Speaker, closed down by this administration. Mr. Speaker, if you go to page 11 of my presentation, I identify a number of the companies that went through Startup Jamaica and the successes they enjoyed. And it's important, Mr. Speaker, to note, and I want to make a point. Many of these companies started off, you'll see this term pivot. They started off doing one business, but through the experience of being in the incubator, they realized that business may not have been the most suitable one, and they shifted to new businesses. So, for example, Jermaine Henry of AgroCentral, who started off, split from his team after not achieving their desired tractions. He was invited by DevLabs, a company that we facilitated, to go to Oakland to develop a new business in California. After a few quick pivots, he worked with Sheldon Trotman to develop a product called FinaTrack. After a year, they generated some traction and got an offer for an undisclosed sum for which they accepted. The two founders returned to Jamaica after that exit, started another company, Flow Factor, an invoicing factor service for agro exporters, using the previous proceeds as collateral for the service. develops, continues to invest in them. Mr. Speaker, there are examples, again, Manning Marsh from Vineless offered investment from First Angels of, is really 200,000 US, decided to turn down the money, used a $25,000 investor grant, and now they have brought their product to market, and they have gone on to launch a new product this summer. And the point, Mr. Speaker, is that is what Startup Jamaica was, an opportunity for young tech entrepreneurs to build businesses, and sadly, the government has closed it down. It's a shame, total shame, total shame. Mr. Speaker, I want to just shift a little to the issue of scientific developments and to look at how the importance of updating our Patents Act to monetize the application of ideas. Patents are an essential tool to monetize the application of ideas. While we are seeking to develop our scientific activity, we will not realize the economic benefits from it unless we strengthen the mechanisms for examining and issuing patents and develop the expertise within the legal system to litigate the defense of these patents issued. These systems raise confidence in our system and increase the chances of attracting investments. The legislation governing how patents work date back to 1854. Although they still nominally provide protection in Jamaica for the exclusive right to exploit intellectual property, there are at least two major repercussions of the lack of an update. One, the fees for patent applications and maintenance are specified within the Act. These nominal amounts have not moved with inflation or changes in the value of our currency over these years. This means that practically it costs more to send a letter today than it does to file a patent application with JIPO. Patent fees, importantly, are supposed to support the operations of the patenting process, including paying the fees of examiners, which is a highly specialized job. Clearly, today's fees cannot do this, which means that our patent management essentially costs the government more to administer than it earns. This is one way that any patent activity in Jamaica fails to have any significant macroeconomic impact. With a few exceptions, Mr. Speaker, patent protection for an invention is limited to the jurisdiction of the country issuing the patent. Also, patent protection must be sought simultaneously. This means that a company seeking patent protection for a potentially valuable invention must choose which markets to pursue patent protection at the outset. There is currently a treaty called the Patent Cooperation Treaty, which is sponsored by the World Intellectual Property Office, which facilitates the process of examining a patent in a way that doesn't jeopardize its validity in other countries. Under the Patent Cooperation Treaty, a patent can be examined under a kind of one-stop shop system that reduces the cost of examination and filing in several countries. Jamaica is not currently a signatory to this Patent Cooperation Treaty, but for example, Trinidad is. And as such, Jamaican inventors cannot take advantage of this filing system. In fact, in some instances, we have Jamaican entrepreneurs who actually go to Trinidad to file a patent application in order to take advantage of the availability of the Patent Cooperation Treaty system. This sort of practice, Mr. Speaker, leads to low measures of innovation in Jamaica, which makes it more difficult to attract serious investors. And the proposed bill, the bill which is now has not been revised for such a long time, will embrace this Patent Cooperation Treaty. Mr. Speaker, the last area, and I see the clock winding down, so I'll just wait before I restart.
House Leader.
Mr. Speaker, I ask that the member's time be extended by 15 minutes to enable him to complete his presentation.
Those in favor?
I only need 2 minutes. Mr. Speaker, we are deeply concerned as an opposition at issues that are evolving at one state-owned agency, Petrojam, which is under the auspices of the Ministry of Energy. Mr. Speaker, there is widespread nepotism where persons who lack the appropriate experience and expertise are being put in critical positions within that entity. There is victimization of staff, of persons who are standing up for principle and who are either being fired or sidelined. There are major project overruns that are taking place at Petrogen. And Mr. Speaker, what is happening at this state-owned agency is what I would call the Wild Wild West. The Wild Wild West at this state agency. Mr. Speaker, it requires the intervention of the Auditor General to go in with immediate effect to examine what is taking place at this entity. Mr. Speaker, we have a situation, for example, where in this entity, donations were made last year of 30 million to a number of entities, just donations to constituencies of politically connected persons, where there is no proof that the donation that would have been made, for example, to a school to undertake a particular project has actually been done. $20 million. No, it's not in the script. Mr. Speaker, it requires the intervention. Requires the intervention of our Auditor General. It requires the intervention of the new Integrity Commission because the viability of this important state agency is being threatened by what is taking place there right now. Mr. Speaker, in summarizing, I have looked very briefly at the 4 critical areas that form the ICT roadmap, which we started in 2012. We believe and support the data protection bill, but there are a number of areas that we believe need to be corrected and amended. We believe the government has to provide stability in the office of the CIO so that we can realize the gains of public sector modernization. We believe that we must implement a digital literacy program so that we can realize the benefits of the investments in our infrastructure. And Mr. Speaker, we believe on the issue of innovation and entrepreneurship that the government has stepped back and reversed the gains that have been made in building an ecosystem of entrepreneurship and innovation. We are committed, when we return to office, to returning to a startup Jamaica, to giving our young people the opportunity to turn their ideas from simply being ideas into businesses. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. God bless you all.
House Leader.
Mr. Speaker, it is not intended to do any further business today. I wish to, on behalf of all of us here, to thank those who have contributed in such a meaningful fashion today. I therefore ask you to suspend the sitting of this House until next week, Tuesday, at 2 p.m., the 29th of May, when we will continue with the sectoral debates. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
The motion is that the House be adjourned until next Tuesday, May 29th at 2 p.m. Those in favor? Those against? No, stands adjourned.
news, current affairs,